Welcome to Interviews with Innocence, a podcast about spirituality, consciousness, and exploring the wisdom our children bring into this world. I believe that our very young children are our greatest teachers. After all, they're the masters of living in the present moment, bubbling in unconditional love, enjoying the messiness of life, and curious about the universe in all its dimensions. The pure essence that young children exhibit lives within all of us. My hope is that these interviews will help us discover, embrace, and connect with the sacred core of childhood that resides within each of our hearts. I am your host, Marla Hughes. Today, I am so happy to welcome back to the show Dr. Tony Cicoria. Dr. Cicoria is a part-time practicing board-certified orthopedic surgeon in Maine, former chief of orthopedics at Chenango Memorial Hospital in Norwich, New York, and clinical assistant professor at orthopedics at SUNY Upstate Medical School in Syracuse. Dr. Cicoria had the unfortunate or fortunate luck of being struck by lightning in 1994. As a result of the lightning, Dr. Cicoria had a near-death and out-of-body experience and became a sudden savant for classical piano music and composition. Today, we're going to talk about his music. Welcome back, Dr. Cicoria.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So jumping right back into where we left off last week, I know you said after your near-death experience that you didn't really talk to anyone about it. Did anyone in your life notice a change in you?
Well, they noticed a lot of changes, and I think probably the biggest change that was noticed was the idea of the music. And so where did that come from? A couple of weeks after the lightning event, and I had seemingly gone back to my normal routine, there was one big thing that was different. I had this insatiable desire to hear classical piano music, and that was a big departure for me. I was a kid of the 60s, and there was rock and roll, and there wasn't much else. My mother had insisted that I play piano when I was 7 years old, so I had to take piano lessons for a year, which I promptly quit and wanted nothing further to do with. And like many kids.
Absolutely.
So there was some early exposure, but nothing that I wanted. And so that had completely died out. And never really came to anything else. But then I had this insatiable desire, and so I was driven so much that I drove to Albany, about an hour away, to a music store that had classical CDs. There was nothing in my small community that would support that. And so when I went into the music store, this CD of Vladimir Ashkenazy playing his favorite Chopin just jumped off the shelf into my hands, and I didn't think anything about it. But from that moment on, I listened to the CD all day long. I made everybody else listen to it, and I'm sure they were sick of it. But there was something that drove me to listen to it. And within a short period of weeks, I realized that it's not going to be enough for me to listen to this music. I have to learn how to play it. But that was a big problem since I didn't have a piano and I didn't know how to play. As I realization I want to learn how to play, the next day our babysitter calls and says, I'm moving and I've got this old upright piano I need to store for a year. Would you guys let me store it at your house? And I thought, okay, that's fortuitous. I want to learn how to play piano, and suddenly piano appears.
Yes.
And so the piano gets there, and I decide to go to the music store and try to get some beginning books on how to play piano. But at the same time, I ordered all of the music on that CD, which I didn't have the faintest idea how to play, but something magical was going to happen and I would get this music. And then I get that the piano gets to the house, and a couple of weeks later, I have a dream. And in this dream, it was like an out of body experience. I'm walking out onto the stage and I see myself sitting at a concert hall piano and I'm playing. And I remember looking around at the concert hall and I even drew a picture of it afterwards. It was so vivid. But I walked up behind myself and I'm listening to this music that I was playing. And I came to the realization, this is not somebody else's music. This is mine.
Right.
And so I paid attention to what I was playing. And the ending of the music had kind of a loud crashing ending, and it woke me up. And I looked at the clock and it's about 3:15 in the morning. And I go out to the piano and I tried to plunk out some of the things that I'd heard, but I had no idea how to write or how to play. So I said, the hell with this, I'm going back to bed. And, and normally I would get up at 6 o'clock. And so I got up and went about my day as usual. But the one thing that had suddenly changed was that the music from the dream just kept playing in my head. And whenever I would stand still, it would start to play. Whenever I sat down at the piano to try to teach myself, it would start playing. And it did it day in, day out, every day. And there were, as I was going along, I was trying to teach myself, and the music would start playing in my head, and I would try to write down a few notes of the melody, but I didn't have any idea how music was written. So I would just I would write down whatever I could manage, and I would put it on a piece of paper and throw it in a drawer, thinking that at some point in my life I'll do something with this. And so I went along this pathway of trying to teach myself until I realized that this was a futile attempt and I needed to get a teacher. And that came, um, it was a couple of years after that, that I actually started taking lessons. And at that point, I started, I auditioned. Her name was Sandy Campbell McCain, and Sandy was trained at Juilliard, and
Mm.
she was the chairman of the music program at Harvard College. And so I auditioned, and she said, bring me some things that you're trying to play, and so I can see where you are in this process. And I took some pieces of music that I was struggling to learn, and she said, okay, I don't want to hear you play them again until I say it's okay. And she said, you don't have any basics to play these things with. And that's where we're going to start. So we started at the very bottom, fingering, scales, you name it, that's where we started.
Right.
And we started progressing. But one of the things that she was very helpful with was I had told her the story about the dream and the music. And by that time, I was able to at least um, start to repeat some of the things that I'd heard. And I would say, how do I write something like this? And, I would play it and she said, well, it's 4/5 this and against 3 on that. And I'm like, oh my God, this is way over my head. And so but I just kept, going along the pathway that I was on. And, she gave me 2 hours a week where I would have lessons. And I just kept doing that for quite a period of time. And it wasn't until 2006 when things really started to change. In 2002, I started going to a piano music camp for adults called the Sonata in Bennington, Vermont. And and this was just a group of adults um, that were at piano camp, so to speak.
Nice.
And this was a great experience because I was at a group with people that everyone loved the same thing, playing a piano. And when I went in 2006, um, the owner, the owner's sister, the owner was Polly Vanderlind, and Polly's sister Erica was a concert pianist, and she was also the number one Steinway salesperson in New York City.
Perfect.
And she had just left Steinway and went to Bosendorfer, another competing piano company. And she had a bunch of pianos that brought in for people to play on, just as an advertising gimmick, I'm sure. But on that particular week in May of 2006, we got talking, and she was interested in how I had gotten to where I was. And I told her the whole story, and she looked at me and she said, "There's only one person that can tell this story, and that's Oliver Sacks." And I'm
Yes.
like, okay. At the time, I didn't know who Oliver Sacks was, other than he wrote the book Awakenings.
I actually had to Google Oliver Sacks after I read,
Yeah.
that you had so many wonderful experiences with him.
So, at that point, I thought, okay, well, that was interesting. And so I went about my business. But then I think it was August of 2006, I get a call from Oliver Sacks. And I'm like, holy crap. And Oliver says, look, he said, I've heard about this story and I'd like you to come down to New York. I've got a collection of patients who've had unusual experiences like yours, and I want to involve you in this process of these patients. And I thought, like, it's got to be pretty interesting. So I made plans to go down, and I spent the day with Oliver, which was an incredible experience in and of
Mhm.
itself. And I had told him this whole story, and at the end of the day, and literally, we spent the entire day talking. And I was saying goodnight to him at the doorway, and he looked at me, and it was like he looked right through me. And he said to me, "The music from the dream went through an awful lot of trouble to get here. The least you can do is write it." And I was so struck by that and so
Yeah.
taken by it. I I went home and I was absolutely possessed to write the music. And so, but I had no idea how to write. So I got a music writing program for dummies called Sibelius, and which was a great tool for me because the music was always exactly the same as it played in my head, and all I had to learn how to do was to match what I wrote on the paper with what I heard in my head. And so I started that process and would continue literally every day. And I spent the next 7 months, every spare minute, um, doing that. And at the end of that period of time, I finished what I affectionately called the Lightning Sonata. And my objective was to play it for my piano group in May of 2007. And because I went every year at the same time. And then, so I finished the music and I took it up to my piano camp and I played it for my group. And I was pretty pleased with the way it came out, and felt like it was a very clear duplication of the music I had been given in the dream. And at that point, while I was at music camp, Oliver called and said, "Hey, I want to use your story in my book." And I thought, okay, why not? It's not going to hurt anybody.
Right.
And at that point, he said, "Good, because it's coming out June 23rd in the New Yorker." And I thought, whoa, wait a minute. I didn't know if I was ready for that.
Right.
And so I thought, it is what it is. And so I went along with it. And so the article came out in the New Yorker, and suddenly there was a huge interest in the music and the story. And a friend of mine, Carlton Clay, who was at one of the head guys at the music department at State University in New York in Oneonta, where I lived. And Carlton called me and said, "I'd like you to teach a class about all of this stuff that's happened." And I thought, okay, that would be interesting. And the week later he calls and he says, "Could you consider playing the music in the class for us?" Sure. And about a month later he calls and says, "This has really taken on a whole different life of its own. Would you consider doing a concert at the Performing Arts Center here at the state of New York in Oneonta?" And I thought, I'm not ready for that. I haven't the faintest idea how to do something like that. He said, "Yeah, it'll be fine." Yeah, easy for you to say.
Yes, yes.
So, I agreed to do it. And at that point, I called my teacher, Sandy, and I said, "Sandy, I've agreed to do this, but I haven't the faintest idea how to do it." And so she started working with me 4 hours a day from, I think it must have been November sometime of that year, because I had agreed to do this concert on my birthday, January 29th of 2008. And so, she started right at the very beginning, how to walk on the stage, how to do everything.
Wow.
And it was a huge undertaking, for her, for me, for everything. And at that point, I went through this whole process, and by the time the concert date came along, it had changed again, and now it was, this is not going to be just a simple concert, because now the BBC One was coming, and Granada Media was coming, and German television was coming. And there were 3 television crews.
Wow.
And, my life was completely upside down. But somehow got through it all. I managed to do the concert without falling apart, which I was pretty amazed at.
Beautiful.
And I'm sure that, in the back of my mind, I thought, what, if they sent me this music from the other side, they're not going to let me fall on my face and screw it up.
Right. I actually listened to that concert yesterday when I was hiking, and I've got to be honest, I sat down and I just started crying. It's so, I don't know, it brings up a lot of feelings. And I read that Mozart and other famous composers have said that their music comes from heaven. So can you tell us, how does this music come to you?
It's interesting, and I have read, gobs of things about the great composers.
Mm-hmm.
And Mozart was famous for saying that it comes from heaven, and he would be given literally entire pieces of music at one time, and all he had to do was write it down.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just Mozart. Beethoven said the same thing, and so did Brahms, and so have many others. That they usually will say it came from heaven, but they didn't understand where, or it came from a muse associated with the other side. Um, but in my situation, um, the first was clearly a gift in a dream, and it came in one big package, and it was downloaded into my head, and that was it. But then it has never stopped coming, and I get, whenever there's an emotional trigger of some type. I had a very dear friend that died um, young, and I think he was 62, and he was actually my neurologist, John Lucen, and I had I was home actually with pneumonia, so I wasn't working, and all of a sudden, and I was sitting at the piano, and all of a sudden I started hearing this music, and this was a music that was inspired by his passing, and it just came in absolute torrents. And I just started writing it down as quickly as I could, and so the whole piece of music, which I called a rhapsody in D minor, um, was based on the emotional feelings that I had as a result of his passing, and that piece of music literally downloaded into my head, and I always struggled with, okay, where is it downloading from, and where does this music come from? And I have had numerous episodes where music has done that for me. I was One day I was sitting, uh, I was learning a series of Brahms variations based on a Schumann theme, and I was playing one of them, and all of a sudden I started to hear it in a symphony, and I thought, okay, this is pretty strange, and I stopped playing, but the symphony kept going.
Yeah.
And so it truly felt like I had tuned into a frequency, and the music was downloaded into my head. And so, that's one of the pieces of music that I'm working on to give birth to.
Right.
But then there have been lots of other pieces of music where I'll sit down and doodle is the only word I can come up with,
Uh-huh.
at the piano, and all of a sudden that ties into a source, and I can only say that it feels like that there is a frequency where the music exists, or there's a place where the music exists, and I can go through some um, introduction um, that gets me to it, and then the music starts to come, and then at least now I can start to write it down, and I've got a book of one page of many different pieces that if I start to play the music, it takes me right back to where it came from.
Right.
And so and that's kind of the way I work on things. When I finish one thing, then I'll turn to a page that I haven't finished, and I'll play the first page of it, and I'm transported to where the music came from.
Wow. So do you
And
feel that that's why you were brought back? Do you feel
yeah,
that?
I mean, it's very clear to me that, I really felt that the only reason I had been brought back here was because of the music. But I've also quite clearly realized that I don't fully understand what the music represents.
Yes.
And I have often thought that there are healing frequencies in the music, that the music does something to people. Um, and I've seen it over and over again. Every time I've played in a concert, people come up to me afterwards and say, I saw visions, or I saw this, or I felt this, or I felt that.
Mhm.
I've even had people come and ask to lie on the floor underneath the piano
Oh my God.
so that they can feel the vibration of it, because it took them someplace else.
Right. Tony, is it two questions? I mean, I know we are humans, and when someone passes, like your good friend, we do grieve. But is it any easier for you now that you've had this experience? And then along with that, do you kind of look forward when it's time for you to return?
I have absolutely no fear of crossing over. And, in my work, in the hospital, and a lot of people have known about what's happened to me over the years. And, if somebody is struggling with an impending death, they've asked me to go talk to them, and which I gladly do. And so I have no fear of what's on the other side. In fact, I am absolutely convinced that it's just part of the normal life cycle, if you
Yes.
will, and it's nothing to be feared, and everything to be revered. And
Right.
so, I know that when it's time, I'll be ready to go, and I know that I don't get to go until then.
Right, exactly. I remember Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll saying that, talking about the cycle of birth and death and rebirth, that it's really on a human level. Of course, we're sad when people pass, very sad. However, on the other side, it's a rebirth for going home, and there's a big celebration there. That's how, just like how we celebrate birth here, and it's just like this beautiful, beautiful cycle. I know
Yeah,
I know you also say that you've become much more just a different person in terms of empathy, and can you just speak on that?
sure. One of the things that I have asked, people in my family and relatives, what do you see that's different? And I remember my sister saying very, very clearly that she said, "You're not the same person." She said, "You're much more empathetic. You're much more aware of other people's feelings, and you have a whole different approach to life that I don't recognize as having been the way you were before."
Right, right.
And I think that that's true. I mean,
Yeah,
I don't think you can go through an experience like this and still espouse the values that you had before, especially if they weren't in tune with what you consider to be reality now.
right, right. Do you feel that this is something I'm passionate about how we could possibly open up the conversation with young children about eternal life and about the sorts of things that we're, what we're talking about, so that throughout, I mean, how beautiful it would be if you had been told not only stories, but this had been sort of your religion, if you will, if you would have been raised with spirituality, living in more of love than in fear of what happens, even though knowing that you would be really sad. Do you think it would make a difference for our young children?
Well, it's an interesting point because one of the things that has become clear is that small children still can see the other side,
Yes.
especially under 3 years old.
Hmm.
They're very innocent, and they may say, they're doing something in a room, and the parent walks in and says, "What are you doing?" And they say, "Well, I'm talking to grandma." And the parent says, "Well, grandma's not there." And they say, "Yes, they are. They're right over there." And you think, okay, what happens to us that we lose that connection?
Right.
And I think one of the things that happens is that it's not acceptable by our convention. And so children are told that's not real.
Right.
Don't say that again. Don't tell anybody because they're going to think you're crazy. And so, there has to be a re-education of the parents, and it will take generations to extinguish a lot of the bad stuff
Hmm.
um, that goes along with it.
Right.
And if we could say it's okay to our children, our very young children, say it's okay to experience those things, and to recognize the validity of what it is they're saying,
Right.
and experience the love that they're carrying with them. I think that you would see a huge change in the population in general.
Right.
But that's going to take an undertaking.
Yes, yes. Well, that's the seed I want to plant in my lifetime, for sure. Well, Tony, thank you so much for coming onto the show. I know that a couple of other things I wanted to just. I know you've been asked before about if you feel like this music has just kind of, not just kind of, but has come to you from your experience or from a past life. And Oliver Sacks weighed in on that. And can you just tell us about that?
Sure. One of the things that I have struggled with is, what does it all mean? Where did it come from?
Hmm.
How is it all related? And in my discussions with Oliver, which went on for years, um, you know, we would write back and forth, and I would tell him about what I thought, and he would tell me about what he thought. And his take on it was somehow the lightning had rewired some circuits in my brain, and that it had given me access to parts of my brain that I didn't know existed, or that I had some genetic memory of, that I wasn't supposed to have in this particular lifetime. And certainly some of the things that he said along that vein made you think, okay, maybe he has some inkling that there is the possibility of reincarnation,
Right,
or genetic memory of some sort. But he would never openly admit that
right.
in any way, shape, or form.
And I find it fascinating that your son is he may have graduated by now, but he's a music major at the School of at Berkeley in Boston, School of
He
Music.
he graduated a few years ago,
Yeah, yeah.
and you know, and my son Chris um, came up out of the basement one day, and he handed me a CD. I think he was probably 13. And I said, "What's this?" And he said, "It's it's a CD of music I wrote." I'm like, "What?" We had no idea. He'd never said anything, and I don't even know how he figured out how to record the stuff, but he had recorded all of the different instruments. He played all the different instruments on it and had recorded it. And we were like, "Wow,
Oh
where
my,
did this come from?" And so, in thinking about all of that, it makes me think that, okay, there's got to be some genes that I've passed along,
right,
that I had no knowledge that I had. There was no family history of musicianship that I knew of. So it's like who knows how old those music genes are,
right,
um, but they certainly presented both in me in one way and him in another.
right, right. And the
And
part of it being downloaded from the
yeah,
divine, that's what I'm going to call it.
and one of the interesting things about it was, I had been contacted um, by Dr. Daryl Treeford, and Dr. Treeford was an expert in savants, and he had wanted to include me in a category of what's called sudden savants, people who suddenly develop an ability that they didn't have before
Right,
as a result of trauma or illness, one thing or another. And what was interesting to me about it is that I got to meet a lot of people through him that were like me. That somebody got hit with a ball in the head and suddenly could calculate dates out to incredible distances,
right,
or somebody else could memorize huge amounts of information, and so all of these people had suddenly an ability that they didn't know they did have. And so that makes you realize that if we're only using a very small percentage of our brains, what's the rest of it doing?
mhm,
And it's the fact that this happens to other people makes you realize that there are parts of our brains that have huge amounts of information that we just don't know how to access.
right,
And that's what it really comes down to. It's knowing how to get these areas. In my case, it took us a bolt of lightning across the head to find access to it. And I'd hate like hell for people to have to go through that to get access to different parts of their brain. But as it turns out, right now, the only technology we have of being able to duplicate that is having some sporadic infection or trauma or surgery or tumors, one thing or another, that somehow allows us access.
right.
And the day that we learn how to do it without all of those other things will be
Yeah.
a great day indeed.
And that's where I'm doing a series on plant medicine. That research is just fascinating with psilocybin and back to LSD and ayahuasca and, those sorts of things to really help and open up those pathways. So that's going to be very interesting to see where that goes in the future. So Tony, what back to the reincarnation, when you were on your journey on the other side, what happened for you to come back with such a strong belief in reincarnation? Was it because you came back with the music talent, or
I think the biggest thing that I came back with, was when I was standing there looking at my body, and I was thinking, my mind was racing, and it never missed a step. from the moment the lightning hit until now. It was always, my brain was just racing. And I say brain, I'm not including my brain. I'm saying my
Right.
mind.
Right.
Because I think
Or
there's
your
a difference.
consciousness. Yes.
Yeah. And my consciousness was with me, whoever I was, when I was standing there looking at my body and realizing that I'm dead, number one. And number two, I'm still conscious. I'm still thinking exactly the way I normally would. And so that realization that I was who I always was tremendous, because that meant that my spirit lived on forever,
Right.
and that whether I come back here again in a different form with different memories, is irregardless. And that's the way I think it happens. But
Mhm.
that's what gave me that realization, was that I saw it, I experienced it.
Did you feel, I've heard people say they're more alive than they are even here. Did you feel that way?
I felt so much more aware of everything,
Yes.
and so much um, perceptive of what this energy was that I was feeling, and it was just a whole order of magnitude different
Yeah.
than what I would normally experience.
But still 100% still you.
Absolutely,
Yeah. Oh, that's
it only comes one way.
so beautiful. Well, thank you so much. It's just been an honor to talk with you. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you'd like to share with our listeners?
No, I think you've covered most of it.
Okay, great. And if people want to find you, how would they do that?
Um, my email is probably the easiest way: tsicoria@yahoo.com.
Great. And I'll be in the show notes too. Are you still practicing medicine?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I work part-time.
Yeah. And you're in Maine now?
Yep.
Yeah.
And so that just, I can't imagine just stopping.
Right, right. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you once again. And you have a wonderful evening. I guess it is there, getting close to evening.
Yeah.
And hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Great.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening in today. If you want to learn more about the show, you can find us at interviewswithinnocence.com and on Facebook or Instagram at Interviews with Innocence. Please write me a message, tell me what you liked, and let me know what else you would like to hear. I would love to hear from you. And if you liked what you heard, please leave us an iTunes rating and review. It helps other listeners find the show. Thank you.